Thank you for coming today. My name is Jennifer Jett. I'm a vice president here at the FCC. Before we begin, I just want to let you know about a couple of other events we have coming up that might be of interest. Next Monday, we'll have a book talk. The book is called Party Life, Chinese Governance and the World Beyond Liberalism by Eric Lee. The next day, the 19th, we have a panel discussion about the shipping industry and Hong Kong's changing role in it, featuring our own Tim Huxley and other prominent figures from the local shipping industry. On the 25th, which is a Monday, we'll have our next film screening, which is a documentary called A Century of Women. It's about 5 women who are 100 years or older from, I think, Austria, India, Turkey, and a couple of other places, Cuba, whose experiences reflect some of the social changes over the past 100 years. And then on the 26th, we have a club lunch about Formula One with the ever-popular Matthew Marsh. That one does tend to sell out, so be sure to sign up for that quickly. And yes, lots going on in the month of March, so keep an eye on your emails. Also a reminder to please silence your phones during this event. And finally, I wanted to give a special welcome to our friends from Club Lusitano down the road who are here with us today for our discussion of The Good War of Consul Reeves by our guest today, Peter Rose. Peter is a graduate of the George Washington University and Yale Law School. He has been a lawyer in Washington, D.C., a chief of staff to a member of Congress, a managing director at Goldman Sachs, and a partner with Blackstone, the American Alternative Investment Management Company. It was during a posting in Hong Kong from 1997 to 2003 that he first became interested in Macau, which he will tell you about today. And he is also an FCC member. So we're very, very happy to have you here today, and please take it away.
Thank you, Jen, and thank you. Thank you all for coming. I just want to talk for about 20 minutes about Macau during the Second World War, and in particular, the role that John Reeves, who was the British consul during the war, played. The first thing to remember about John Reeves was that he was a member of the China Consular Service. And the China Consular Service was a very unique organization set up within the British Foreign Office after the Opium Wars in 1843. And as a result of China's defeat in the Opium Wars, about 90 cities in China eventually opened up to foreign trade. And the British had a presence in about 28 of these. And each one of these 28 cities was a British consul. And this was this was a particularly interesting role because the British consul presided over a little piece of England in China. It had its own police force, it had its own courts, he could sentence people to jail, he acted as a little bit of a ruler in there. So you would think being a member of the China Consular Service would be very prestigious. No, quite to the contrary. Firstly, the Consular Service was held in low esteem in the British Foreign Office. They were the office boys, they were the messengers. They were very low status. The highest ranked consul was outranked by the lowest ranked diplomat. And secondly, the China Consular Service itself was in disrepute. There was a 1927 report from the Foreign Office which noted cases among the consuls in China of insanity, suicide, theft, drunkenness, and horror of horrors, the taking of Chinese women openly and notoriously as concubines and mistresses. And there, just as a picture, that's from a picture of 1915. Not two guys that don't give you much confidence. They were a vice consul and a consul in, I forget the city, in China. So from this inauspicious beginning, John Reeves arrives in Macau as the British consul. He had joined the consular service in 1933. He had been sent to Peking, as it was then, to learn some version of Chinese. He had been posted to Hankow, which is now part of Wuhan, and then Mukden, which was now part of Manchuria. They couldn't have thought much of him because there were no British settlements to administer there. One had been taken over by the nationalists, the other had been taken over by the Japanese. He arrived in Macau, he arrived in Macau in June of 1941. He was ostensibly sent there for a rest cure. We don't know the circumstances. He did drink too much. His marriage was failing. This was not a prestigious assignment. There was no real role for him in Macau. There hadn't been a British consul in Macau since 1846. He was really just sent there to balance the recent arrival of a Japanese consul. So, December 1941, 6 months later, Japan declares war on the West. Within less than 6 months, they had occupied most of Southeast Asia, except they got to the gates of Macau and they stopped. And actually, if you go to the northern border of Macau, that gate is still there. It's a little dwarfed by the Chinese immigration building behind it, but that dates from the 1860s, replacing a gate built in the 1560s. Portugal was neutral, and Japan decided to respect Portuguese neutrality. And Japan never occupied Macau throughout the entire war. So Macau became a kind of an Asian Casablanca with a Portuguese governor, a Japanese consul, a British consul, spies, and refugees. And the British consul, this failed and failing man, suddenly found himself the only senior Allied representative within thousands of miles of Japanese-occupied Asia. So Macau, what was Macau like at the beginning of the Second World War? This is a map from 1950. It's the closest one I could find to the war, but it couldn't have changed. It was a tiny town. 1935, 150,000 people. 1940, 300,000 people. Most of those were Chinese refugees fleeing the fighting. A small economy based entirely on gambling, gasoline, and opium. 20% of Macau's revenues came from opium. 3 manufacturing industries: matches, fireworks, and incest. Incest? That could be true. Incense, excuse me. There was no farmland, 60,000 Japanese troops over the border. It was a life and death struggle throughout the war to keep food and fuel. The rice crop in Canton failed in 1942 and 1943. An American submarine had sunk the ship that was meant to bring rice from Indochina. And at one stage in 1943, the colony was down to 2 weeks of food and fuel. Japanese troops were on the border. They thought Macau was going to be taken. What did the governor do? He decided to take the statue of Our Lady of Fatima out of St. Dominic's and parade it in front of everyone in Macau and place it in a niche in the cathedral with the words, Queen of the World, Mother of Portugal, protect Macau. And you can still go up to the cathedral and see this. How did Macau's economy survive? This man, P.J. Lobo, headed up the Bureau of Economic Services. He was a PhD in economics, a Timorese orphan. He created a trading company, 1/3 owned by the Macau government, 1/3 owned by wealthy Macanese, and very smartly, 1/3 owned by the Japanese government, the Japanese army. And anything they could find in Macau, old cannons from the Barra Fort, military equipment, the gunboat, were traded for food and fuel. Heavily involved was a young 19-year-old secretary of the company. You may know his name, Stanley Ho. The other reason was the Banco Nacional Ultramarino. Please, I don't speak Portuguese. They managed to keep the economy afloat. There were 9 or 10 currencies circulating, everything from US dollars, Japanese military scrip, Chinese silver coins. They did currency trading, they financed the opium trade, they financed the trade in tungsten. They even at one stage printed their own banknotes. What was life like for the middle class? For the middle class and the wealthy, it was astoundingly normal. There's bunches of books written about life in Macau during the war. This is just one I found in New York. You read about concerts, you read about fundraisers, you read about dinners in shady gardens. You read about prize givings and theatricals. Reeves himself talks about watching tennis matches at the Civil Tennis Club in the shade next to the governor's mansion. The Macau Electric Company had a clubhouse with its own orchestra that continued throughout the war. As Stanley Ho said, for the wealthy, anything was available. Now, there were a number of English language newspapers published in Macau. Only a few copies survive in the National Library of Australia, and I went through them and just looked at some of the ads. You want to see a first-run American movie? In 1944, you could go to the Capitol Theater and see it. You want Australian butter? You want American or European pharmaceuticals? If you had money, all of that was available. Go to the Hotel Riviera, listen to Art Canero's orchestra, have dinner there. The ice factory kept going, ice cream, popsicles. This is my favorite ad. Where they got it, I'm not quite sure, but it was very cheap. And the Consul General sent Christmas cards. Let's look at Macau and the refugees. This man is the real hero in one sense of this. The governor, Gabriel Teixeira, I think I'm pronouncing his name right. He essentially made the decision he would open up Macau to anyone that would come, despite the fact there were no natural resources to support them. Now, if you were Chinese and fleeing the fighting, you were largely farmers and peasants, life was pretty grim. Refugees flooded over the border. In one 3-week period in 1944, 80,000 arrived. The population at the end of the war was 600,000. The government and the Chinese aid societies did their best, but people died on the streets in scores every day. Dysentery, exposure, starvation, cold, cholera. There were constant rumors and accounts of cannibalism. If you were Portuguese, it was a little better. The government took all the gaming revenues and gave every Portuguese refugee a small allowance. And no matter how tenuous your connection to Portugal was, you were entitled to this allowance. They were housed wherever they could. This is now the restored Teatro Dom Pedro V. 200 people crammed into that little theater. I don't know if you've ever visited it in Macau. That's the Bella Vista Hotel, 30 rooms, plus the public rooms, 300 Portuguese refugees in there. What about the British refugees? John Reeves took care of 9,000 British refugees. These would have included white Englishmen, plus Indians, plus Chinese, anyone with a claim to British nationality. He also took care of 1,000 Americans, they were largely Filipinos who were working in the entertainment and hospitality industry. He started with a staff of 1. He ended up with a staff of 150. He was bigger than most embassies. He had 3 full-time doctors and a small dispensary, had his own pharmacy. He started with a loan from a local Chinese merchant, and then 1.7 million pounds, which was a lot of money in those days, arrived from the Colonial Office to fund it. All of it he accurately accounted for within a few pennies by the end of the war. An astounding feat of organization to feed and house these people. He had no blueprint for doing it. He had no help. He had to figure it out himself. Let's talk about espionage in Macau. And just in the research, just dozens of various spy groups. These are just some of the ones I made a list of. The most interesting was the US Navy, which we don't have time to talk about. The British Army Aid Group, which was started by Dr. Lindsay Ride, who was a professor of physiology at the University of Hong Kong Medical School, captured by the Japanese, escaped, and found it, and with about 100 soldiers and 30 officers, ran spy rings in Macau and in Hong Kong, and aided escapees and others. They had a clandestine radio station in the Salesian School in Macau, and at one stage, they needed parts for it. They were in the basement of the BNU, the Banco Nacional Ultramarino. They were Japanese watching to make sure that no one took them. They created a flood, disguised themselves as plumbers, went in the basement, got the parts, and got the radio working again. Escapes from Macau. Reeves helped 300 people escape from Macau to Chongqing, which is in the middle of Sichuan province. So just stop and think about walking largely from Macau to Sichuan through war-torn China. It was now. Whoops, sorry. Let's go back. It was the BAG had a network of bandits, guerrillas, and pirates. Remember, the Japanese troops, they had 1 million people, they had 1 million soldiers in China, but it's a big country. And they were largely in the cities and strategic points. They didn't run into, you didn't worry about the Japanese intercepting you. And there were pirates, there were bandits, there were guerrillas. All they wanted was a little money. No one was in real danger. And some of the parties included children and babies, children as young as 3 and 5, that were on this long walk. You shouldn't underestimate how grueling it was. It was 800 miles. It was 800 miles, and largely you do this on foot and on sampans. It was weeks of struggling up hills and through mud and falling in rivers and sleeping in barns and getting lice and rats and things like that, dealing with sampans with just a plank at the end for a toilet. And suddenly you found yourself in nationalist China. There was a man from the British Embassy. You were put on a train, taken to Chongqing, and then flown out to Calcutta. An astounding success story. I'm conscious of time. Reeves was hated by the Foreign Office despite everything he did. And why was he hated? He was a constant thorn in their side. Firstly, he insisted on writing Hong Kong as one word. In 1926, the Foreign Office had decided that Hong Kong would be 2 words. He refused to do that. They'd finally managed to smuggle in a code so he could communicate safely with Chongqing. He got drunk at a dinner party and talked about it. There's this wonderful terse note which I found in the files of the archives, in which somebody's complaining about, we'll have to find another way to get the code to him, and he himself compromised this. He constantly went beyond his mandate. Despite repeated warnings. He ran an intelligence network with over 100 spies. The Foreign Office told him to stop. He was in contact with the American OSS, the predecessor of the CIA. Foreign Office told him to stop. In defense of the Foreign Office, they were just constantly being surprised with what he was up to. And I think as a career move within the civil service, surprising your boss is not a good way of doing it. And at one stage, he put together a whole organization plan for what Hong Kong would look like after the war. And if you look at the very person who's kind of up front at the top in the center, it is the British Consul. I've looked at this document. It's in the National Library of Australia. It goes on for 80 pages. It's where the sewer lines are going to be. It's the design of the identity cards. The Foreign Office went completely nuts about this. And at one stage, if you read this closely, they were trying to get an aircraft into Macau to smuggle him out, smuggle him out of there. So let me just wrap this up very quickly in an epilogue. So the minute the war would, what? Okay, well, okay. So the minute the war was over, his wife and daughter leave him. They go back to England. They go to England. He never sees them again. He wants to stay in Macau just another 6 months to finish his work. They deny him permission to that. You can't help but see the next stages in his career as an attempt to force him out. He has made he has made a consul in Rome. You think this is a glamorous job? Well, they gave him the poorest parts of Italy and all the outlying islands. And if you can think of Rome in Italy in 1947, it was not a glamorous assignment. 3 years later, they transfer him to Surabaya, the capital of Java. Almost an impossible job for a British, because Surabaya in November 1945, British troops had come in there and put down a rebellion by the Indonesians against the Dutch, with great loss of life of Indonesian civilians and militia. Even today in Indonesia, November the 10th is celebrated as Heroes Day. Within a few months of arriving in Surabaya, he quits the consular service, moves to South Africa. He becomes a sportscaster, and he turns into a complete eccentric. Friends describe him in South Africa as surrounded by Chinese curios and furniture he'd collected. He grew his hair long down to his shoulders, which in 1947 in apartheid South Africa must have been quite a sight, which he'd either wear down his shoulders or tied with a ponytail at the back. He had his wine served in goblets. He wore a pair of Manchu slippers that he had bought in Peking, ostensibly that the last Dowager Empress had worn. He had his own ivory carved cigarette holder, his own pair of ivory chopsticks, and dressed entirely in Chinese robes. He was a lonely, tragic man who did the best he could under very trying circumstances and was never recognized. In the manuscript that was left behind, when the manuscript he left behind and they found after he died, he talked about from 700 miles west of Chongqing, 1,800 miles north of Vladivostok, 5,000 miles east to Honolulu, and 3,000 miles south to Australia, mine was the lone flag. Thank you. That's great. Let's go back to the quote.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
There we go.
I'll ask a couple of questions and then we'll open it up to the audience because I'm sure we've got some questions out there as well. So first of all, how did you come across his story? You mentioned you were posted in Hong Kong. You became interested in Macau at that time. What was it about Macau that interested you, and how did you come across his story, and then how did you research it?
We loved to go to Macau just because it was different. It's easy to get to, and you turn even with all the demolition that there's been, you can still go to blocks, turn a corner, and swear you're in a small provincial Portuguese town. And then Jason Wordie, the historian, the preeminent historian of Hong Kong, and if you haven't got Jason Wordie's book on Macau, which is quite a doorstop, but it's the definitive architectural, historical, and guide to Macau. You should get it. He mentioned that it had never been occupied by the Japanese during the war. It was neutral. And I just got interested in it. And once I retired, I had the time to start the research.
And you said the archives and your sources were quite far-flung.
The New York Public Library has a huge amount of material on every conceivable subject, and that was a help. But there are, one of the major archives is in the National Library of Australia in Canberra, which is not exactly around the corner. Pan American, Macau was a base for Pan America in their trans-Pacific flights. The Pan American archives are in the University of Miami in Florida. Obviously, there's the British National Archives in Kew. The U.S. archives are in Washington, D.C. And there are documents in Hong Kong, documents in Macau. The Australian National War Memorial has a great library. And
I understand he wrote his own memoir as well?
He wrote a memoir called The Lone Flag, that the Foreign Office, in their perpetual attempt to screw him, denied him permission to publish. saying it would serve no useful purpose. After his death, they found the manuscript, and the Royal Asiatic Society, about 10 years, brought an edition of it out. It is very much, I don't mean to insult anyone, but it's a very much a work written by somebody who grew up in the civil service. It's, I had to read it with a ruler to make sure that, but you know, if you read it carefully, you can get bits and pieces. You can get bits and pieces. And then the footnotes will take you to other documents.
So your book is a fictionalized version of
Right.
this story. So my question is, what were some of the gaps that you had to fill in, and to what extent, how did you decide how to sort of sketch out his character?
Well, a lot of it was just close reading of the things he said in his book. What's the type of person that would say that? Things are missing from the archive. There's no personnel file for him. So some of the documents reprimanding him show up in other ones, but there's no central personnel file. And then just to try and think about why would they transfer him to Surabaya? Why was he so actively disliked when he did such a? So it is speculation on my part, but at least there's a basis for saying that.
Let's take some questions from the audience, starting back here.
Yes, sir.
I haven't read the book yet, so
You've had 20 minutes.
but is there any mention of the Phu Tak Lam story in the book?
Which story, sir?
Phu Tak Lam, F-U-T-A-K-L-A-M.
Sadly,
There's
the
a
answer
book
is
which you might enjoy reading. Phu Tak Lam was Stanley Ho before Stanley Ho. So from about mid-20s through the mid-60s, he controlled all the prostitution, drugs, and gambling in Macau and Shenzhen. He's not in this somehow?
I was unaware of him. I knew before that at the Lisboa and the Central Hotel there was gambling. I think I know the guy who owned the Central Hotel and ran it. I think that's the person you're referring to. There's a glancing reference to it. I had to make cuts because it was getting way too long.
By the way, you might enjoy it. Phu Tak Lam.
Thank you for
Books
that.
available in Bookzine, I think. Phu, the Furama Hotel, few this, few that Phu.
Thank you.
Yes, question right here.
Thank you for being here today. What an inspiring and interesting story. What was the single most interesting fact that kind of resonated with you going through your research and writing your book? What was the one thing that you came away with going, wow, that's interesting?
There are a lot of really interesting things. Alicia, my wife Alicia and I have this conversation about some of the fascinating women that I didn't have time, there wasn't space to put in there. A woman who somehow the war, they came into their own during the war. One of the manuscripts that I found, for example, in the Imperial War Museum in London, is a fascinating 20 pages an account of an escape written by Marjorie Fletcher. Her husband was the CEO of the Macau Electric Company. And they took their 11-year-old son, Donald, and a bunch of babies from other people, and this group of 30 ended up walking through 800 miles until they could get to Chongqing and get rescued. And her account, you know, she was a woman of her time. She lived obviously a very comfortable life in Macau, and she was sleeping in barns and slipping down this and Florence Lim, who shows up in the book, was the first woman ever ordained as an Anglican priest. And it took she was ordained in 1944. It wasn't until the 1970s that women were formally accepted into the Anglican Church. Phyllis Harrop who was working for the Hong Kong police and stayed behind after the Japanese invasion to organize brothels, working with the Japanese medical officers in order to prevent mass rape by the Japanese soldiers of the Chinese female population at the time. And then, as I said, just the bizarreness of this little enclave in which, as I said, you saw those ads, and apparently normal life was going on, at least if you were middle class and above, while, you know, World War II was raging just across the border.
Thank you.
Yes, question here?
Can we expect to see a statue of Reeves somewhere?
Not in front of the Foreign Office. But it would be nice if he was recognized somewhere in Macau, because there should definitely be a statue of Teixeira, the governor. If there's not one already, I'm not aware of one. He should have some recognition in Macau. The building that the British consulate was in is long demolished, and there's not even an existing picture of it. The building he lived in, his residence, is still there, Skyline. It's up on the Pena Hill, near that big ugly cement basilica sort of a thing up there. Beautiful Art Deco building.
Thank you.
Yes, question here.
You mentioned the book, The Lone Flag. It's a great book. I was in Macau during the war.
Yes,
I found it extremely interesting.
Oh,
I-
yes, one more time with the
Sorry,
microphone,
yes.
please.
I'll say that all over again. You mentioned the book, The Lone Flag, and I would recommend it to people to read it. I was in Macau during the war, and I found it very, very interesting. And a lot of the stories I can relate to, because a lot of people he mentioned I know, or I knew. He was a great friend of the hero that you mentioned, Teixeira. And perhaps I can relate a little story about Teixeira. My brother-in-law was also in Macau. He was much older than I. And he was playing for a Hong Kong football team in Macau. And one day they had a match between the Hong Kong refugees and the Macau team. And the governor, Teixeira, attended this match. And the governor looked at the players and they saw that the refugees had a T-shirt with the letter R written on it. So Teixeira said, "What's this R all about?" And it says, "That means refugiados," means refugees, he said. He says, "Take those shirts off. They're not refugees. They are guests. They're our guests." So this, I think, illustrates the measure of the man, Teixeira. It's a great film.
Great fellow. There was a little bit of a tension between the Macanese and the Hong Kong Portuguese who came as refugees. Macanese were much more conservative, and the Hong Kong guests, let's call them that, the Hong Kong guests had come from the big city where they lived a faster life. And so at some of the dances and things like that, there was a little bit of, you can read in the manuscripts with the tension between the Macanese family, worried about their daughters going out with these kind of racy Hong Kong guys. Still the same.
Yes, right here.
You mentioned Florence Lee, who was ordained 80 years ago.
It would have been 80 years
Yeah,
ago.
it's 80 years. There's a big in the Anglican. I'm an Anglican priest, and in the church in the Church of England there's a big exhibit celebration.
Oh, there is.
Because the second, third, and fourth Anglican priests women priests were also ordained in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong and Macau pioneered in the ordination of women clergy. Did Consul Reeves know her?
He, towards the end, and I found the programs again in the archives of the National Library of Australia. He presided over a number of Thanksgiving services for the end of the war. So I presume they were acquainted. There is no indication in anything I read that he was a regular churchgoer.
Seems unlikely.
It would, given his life, I would say that. And you know, the Protestant chapel up there is, you know, it's tiny. It's
Morrison Chapel.
the Morrison Chapel
But,
is no,
but there was a bigger church too, St. Mark's.
right. And Ronald, you know, you can thank Ronald Hall, who was the Bishop of Hong Kong at the time, the Pink Bishop, who just decided to do this without checking with anyone. Smuggled Florence Lynn out of Macau, and I forget the name of the town. There was a little Anglican church in there. They prayed together for several days, and then he ordained her, and then she was smuggled back into Macau.
And what happened to her after the war?
After the war, they forced her to resign.
She voluntarily resigned because Bishop Hall would have been fired.
Right. I mean, I use the word forced, use the word volunteered. I think we're saying the same thing. We're saying the thing. She went to Guangdong, and you correct me if I'm wrong, and got caught up in the whole Cultural Revolution. Red Guard
She
was
went to Guangdong and continued to serve as a priest until the Cultural Revolution.
right, and then she ended up in Canada.
She went to Canada with her sister was. I've written we have books about this. I'm from the Hong Kong Shanghai Hui Archives, which is just up the hill. I'm a historian. Yeah, so she was a fascinating person. She has a biography too, her autobiography.
Okay.
So many good books that are coming up today. Did we have a question from Patrick Rosario, president of Club Lusitano?
I'm Pedro Rosario with Club Lusitano. So one question, how was obviously Reeves has a good relationship with the Portuguese governor, but how's the relationship between the British governments and Portuguese government at the time in Macau during the war? They collaborating or they?
It's a little unclear, and I didn't, I think it was a little tense at the moment because you had the Treaty of 13, the oldest existing mutual treaty alliance between Portugal and Great Britain, and Macau was lying there defenseless, and with just 1,500 troops, the Japanese could have taken it in a slow afternoon. And there was no chance that the British were going to come and help save Macau. And if you look at what Salazar was trying to do at the time, this kind of constructive, collaborative neutrality, I think was the phrase that he used, because he had to balance between the Axis and the Allies at one stage. He had a border, the French border, there was a German army on his northern border, and so it wasn't really until '43 in which they leased the Azores to the Allies that it came. But I never really came across anything involving Reeves actually having to represent the British government. You know, and advocate for that. There's a scene in the book where he meets the governor, and they realize they're just two people in an obscure part of the world, and you know, the real work is going on way beyond them. Does that answer your question?
I think we had a question over here.
Thanks for an enlightening and delightful presentation. The question I have is would Reeves have been conducting the normal consular activities? And what I'm particularly thinking about is would there have been contact with the Japanese consul and in normal consular works? And is there any evidence that of how he dealt with that?
Until they moved the consulate to a bigger location because it was growing so much, the Japanese consulate and the British consulate were next door to each other. And if you look at the photographs in the Lone Flag, there's a picture of the old Japanese consulate because they think that the British consulate was identical to that. There were instructions from the Foreign Office for all of its consular and diplomatic, all of the consular and diplomatic staff, if you were in a neutral country and you ran into a Japanese official, you would greet them. The phrase was something like, with cold indifference. But he seemed to be, Mr. Fuki, who was the Japanese consul, seemed to be a man of erudition and grace and was instrumental in getting Reeves's wife out of Hong Kong. She had been traveling from Shanghai and was Christmas shopping in Hong Kong and got there. And then, of course, December the 8th happened. She couldn't get back to Macau and was interned for a month in Stanley, along with everyone else. And finally, as a spouse of a diplomatic personnel, the Argentinian consul actually got her out, but he worked on that. And so they seemed to, they ran into each other at garden parties. There was the the big Portuguese and things like that. And they seemed to have a cordial relationship. And the Japanese consul, who was assassinated in 1944 by, we think, the Japanese people acting on behalf of the Japanese military, because he was too friendly. They seem to have a cordial relationship.
I think, yes. Question over here, and then Elaine.
Thanks, Peter. In your one of your slides, you listed all of the spy agencies that were operating, and you alluded to something about the American Navy. They seem to have been very, a lot of operations in Macau. It'd be great to get some insights from you.
Yeah, the American Navy had one of the most successful espionage operations in China, by far better than the British SOE or the American OSS. They started out in 1941 with weather stations because they wanted to know what it would be like in the Pacific 5 days later, and the way you looked at the weather in northern China, and that would tell you what was going on. In the end, there were over several thousand American Navy personnel, post office personnel, a Navy cavalry unit, because up in Mongolia to patrol between the weather stations up there. And an astounding man, who was a commander at the time, with the name of Mary Mills. And he decided the way to run an espionage operation was to act Chinese. So he placed himself under the command of Tai Li, who was Chiang Kai-shek's kind of FBI, CIA, and everything, as his deputy, and insisted on all of the American soldiers living with the Chinese, squatting on the ground and eating, and only eating Chinese food, and integrated himself within there. And eventually, they were all, I found one map in the National Archives that showed them around the edge of Macau. I didn't find them operating in Macau itself. But there's a couple of great books, one called The Rice Paddy Navy, about that. And just, it's an example of if you're going to run an espionage operation in a country in which you stand out. It's not like wandering through France or wandering through Germany where you're just another Caucasian. I know how to make it work.
Elaine, you had a question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting introduction to this gentleman. So, in spite of him having behavioral deficiencies, one might say, you don't suggest at all that he had was underhanded with regard to funds, or, I mean, in the times in which he lived and in his position, surely he could have had sidelines and appropriated funds and things, but it doesn't sound like that he did. I mean, surely that in itself is remarkable.
Quite to the contrary. He hired a Portuguese accountant, a Macanese accountant, and he was very proud of the 1.7 million pounds. They were off on their accounts by under a shilling, under 12 pennies, by the end of it. And he was incredibly proud of this. And it was just dismissed by dismissed by the Foreign Office because he hadn't used the proper consular accounting system to keep track of it. But there was no implication whatsoever that I found anywhere that he had done anything underhanded. He just didn't feel like behaving like a regular civil servant.
That's quite remarkable in and of itself for the times in which he lived, I would have thought.
When you consider some of the, what P.J. Lobo and Stanley Ho and, the economy largely based on smuggling at that stage, yes.
Yes.
Just a postscript to the Futak Lam comment. That's the founder. He got out of Macau, left it to Stanley, and brought everything to Hong Kong and founded the Furama Hotel.
Huh. The leading Macanese spy for the BAG, the British Army Aid Group, is Y.C. Liang, who went on to found the Macau ferry back and forth. And very sadly, he and his son committed suicide in the 60s. And he was the one who originally lent, Y.C. Liang was the guy who originally lent Reeves the money to fund the refugees. And the note that he gave had zero interest and to be repaid when the war is over. It was essentially a gift.
Yes, question over here.
Yeah, what happened to his descendants? Have they researched into it?
Well, yeah, when he died in South Africa in I forget. His daughter had died a long time before, and the people who are the executors of estate contacted his wife, who was still living in England. She renounced any interest in his estate. So presumably she is no longer with us, and there are no direct descendants left.
He was an only child.
He was an only child, exactly. There were nieces and nephews, if you read the early accounts, and so there are obviously collateral descendants on either side. I never tracked them down.
I'm so glad you asked that question, because that's the question I wanted to ask. Any other questions? Okay, anything else you wanted to say before we wrap up?
I just thank you all for coming, and I appreciate you listening.
Well, thank you so much.